Thank you very much for coming to hear Delton and I talk about the carbon markets. The order of operations today are, we're going to discuss a little about our backgrounds and give you guys some context of why we do what we do in this space. And then Delton's going to describe, and I'm going to interview Delton about what Global Carbon Awards are about and how that's going to function in theory. And then we'll open up to questions. So we'll spend about 15 or so minutes on the interview, 15 or so minutes sort of going back and forth, and then we'll have a Q&A. And hopefully our next door neighbors at whatever country is next door will be a little quieter. A little bit about me, and then Delton will describe himself, and we'll sort of take it from there. For better or worse, I've been at the intersection of institutional capital, the environment, energy, and the infrastructure around energy and the environment since 1986, for better or worse. So that makes me either early, stupid, whatever. I was six blonde and good looking when I first started doing this, and it's so nice to see a bunch of old friends in the space. I've invested across the entire spectrum of assets in the carbon markets, from permits, offsets, allowances, etc. And I've done a lot of stuff in the energy space, both in the US, Europe, and Asia. I was instrumental in creating Goldman's private investment business in this space. Worked at the firm for a very long time and was promoted before the IPO. And did the same thing for a variety of firms. And I probably owned half a dozen carbon businesses in my career. Don't own any carbon, just FYI. And this is the longest time in my professional career I haven't owned a carbon business. And for my sins, I did a master's in externality evaluation of air, water up in New Haven at Yale back in the late 80s, early 90s. So the good or the bad news is I really believe in using markets and regulatory processes to solve social problems. The bad news is I thought I was early, and here we are in 2023, and we're still doing it. So the good news is there's still a lot of opportunity, and someday I'll stop working, and it'll be up to you guys to take it forward. But I'm a true believer from the Wayback Machine, and I truly want to make this stuff function. Delton, why don't you tell the guys a little bit about yourself, and we can take it from there.
Thanks, Tony, and thank you to the Bhutan Foundation for organising this, even though there are a few problems. My background is engineering, and I've started a project which is to develop a new economic policy that is scalable. This might be strange, given that my background is actually in environmental engineering, water, groundwater resources, mining, and so on. But I really wanted to use my technical background to try and understand what economists were thinking and why we don't have practical, scalable financial solutions to address these environmental problems, and looking at the problem at a fundamental level.
Terrific. So maybe it's to help set the stage to differentiate what Delton's proposing versus what exists. Delton, why don't we describe a little bit about what the policy alternatives are and how you came up with that idea, and why do you think there is room in the discourse for your approach?
Sure. The way that economists understand the market failure is through the classical theory from Arthur Pigou. And that theory looks at social impacts, or economic impacts on people because of the actions and activities of other people and businesses. So it's called the social cost of carbon. And to correct it, they advise we have a carbon tax, a price, or cap and trade, or something similar that is a stick, a pricing stick. So when people stand up in conferences like this and they say we need a price on carbon, 99 times out of 100 they mean a carbon tax of some kind. However, it is also possible to offer carrots, and we have carrots such as the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, various kinds of subsidies. But because economists are thinking in fairly narrow terms, they haven't looked at the power of financial assets that are like currencies and can be traded with other currencies. And they haven't really looked at the potential of combining carrots with sticks to maximise cooperation across society. So I was really interested in this carrot and stick approach and understanding what can a carrot do for us in relation to the political gridlock that is holding us back globally on speed and scale finance and speed and scale responses to this climate crisis.
So
Here, take this.
So, Delton, so your approach, ultimately, how does that work with a command control regulatory regime versus a cap and trade approach versus an allowance approach versus a hybrid cap and trade approach? Are they mutually exclusive? Can they work together? Do you have to change the existing paradigm to allow your approach to be adopted?
The interesting and powerful feature of introducing a carbon reward, which is this new carrot, is that it's complementary to these other approaches, be they regulatory, taxes, cap and trade, or carbon markets. So it can overlay these other pricing mechanisms.
Maybe we can send someone next door to tell these guys to be a little quieter, because it's really, I can't hear myself think, and I'm a pretty loud guy. So if I understand your proposals succinctly, it actually sits on top of or adjacent to all the existing approaches, does not substitute or replicate them, but allows a more innovative approach to solving these social regulatory problems without necessarily upsetting what potentially is happening in the country since over 6.
Correct, and I would actually take it a step further, Tony. The way I see it actually is that the carbon reward, with taxes, cap and trade and subsidies, and the other options that are available, actually form a family of pricing signals. And my opinion is that the economics textbooks haven't yet discovered this, or the economists haven't discovered that there's actually a logical family of pricing, which I call a carbon pricing classification table. And it includes not only these major policies we're discussing, but also carbon credits that are in compliance markets and voluntary markets. So there's a certain logical structure to the various social agreements that are plausible. But economists haven't looked at this reward concept because we've never used it before and we've never considered it before.
Why do you think that is? Why have we limited ourselves to either command control, which is essentially regulatory driven, or market-based allowance incentives? Why haven't we thought about it? And what analogies can you find in the global financial markets that would make you think that such a currency could exist?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, the problem, I believe, is that the market failure that we have, this climate crisis, is not a classical market failure. So if you believe the classical theory, you won't look for new ideas or major new policies or new problems. But my interpretation is that the market failure actually is different because we're dealing with energy, which is strongly physically coupled to carbon, and we have in this market failure very strong network effects, such that we're dependent on the fossil fuel energy system, and because we're so dependent on it, it creates social and political friction to try and untangle that. So because of the network effects, the frictions, and the coupling between carbon, energy, and profits, it's way beyond a classical market failure. And the resolution, I think, is a parallel economy based on this carbon currency. We don't have the slides, but the carbon currency.
So if I want to get more, if I wanted to sort of monetize my ability to create incremental reductions or my behavior that would not necessarily be captured either in the traditional sense in a regulatory command control approach or in a permit approach, how would I utilize this reward, this fiat currency we're trying to create?
Sure.
Walk me through an example of how it works.
Okay, well, I'll explain the financial mechanism with a kind of a simple example. We need to understand that there are two general types of mitigation that are needed. The first is conventional, where we provide cleaner energy and decarbonise industries. That's conventional. Then we have carbon removal from the atmosphere. So they're distinctly different. So in this approach, we can fully fund carbon removal with an explicit price signal, a global price signal, and fully fund it. It's at the tune of $1 trillion a year. Now, for the other stuff, clean energy, cleaner industry, it takes a bit more discussion to explain this, but the power of it is that we have a flexible tool to exchange fossil fuel assets for renewable energy assets. So this takes a bit of explaining, but I'll give a simple example. So imagine there's an oil and gas reserve and license in the Congo rainforest. Okay? The people there, the government there, wants to extract because they need revenue. They want to develop their economy. They don't have much money. Borrowing's expensive. So they're looking at extraction. But if we come along with the reward, we can buy that lease from them, buy them out at a level that is commensurate with the profit they would have earned on that oil and gas, but with a contract, a voluntary contract that says you got to take the carbon currency reward and invest most of that into a renewable energy supply system for that region. So in effect, we're buying the lease to keep the fossil fuels in the ground, but in return, they have to use the profits or most of it to build renewable energy substitution.
So how would you, as the father of this approach, you've been at it now for 9 years, I guess there's a bunch of questions that come to mind. Why hasn't it happened sooner? Why isn't it part of the policy dialogue? What's stopping it from happening? Why is it not, is it Bitcoin or is it Tether? Or is it none of those things? Help me, I'm a simple guy. I just want to make sure that, we have reliable, quantifiable, certifiable, and verifiable reductions that are mercantile, allow people to put prices on carbon. That's my reason for living. Help me walk through this thing, because if it's such a great idea, it should have happened a long time ago. What happened?
Well, the problem is complex. That's the first thing. I think it does take an interdisciplinary approach to understand all the moving parts. However, there are examples in the economy where the world is sort of incrementally moving towards something like this. For example, Ecuador, they asked the world to pay to keep their fossil fuels in the ground. So as a concept, that's not entirely new.
Right. In the ground, we live in ground lobby, get paid not to produce.
Yeah. There's a guy I met here at COP who is doing just that in the US with coal lease. They formulated a model where they could buy the coal lease. But now we're discovering also that carbon credits and offsetting isn't really going to get us to the Paris goals. It's a matter of failing before people realise we need an alternative.
Totally understand that. I think the bigger question, when I hear you, and I've obviously read your papers, I think the bigger question to me is how do we create complementary policies that can come out, that get both adopted by the creators of the offsets and the users of the offsets. And one of the people in this audience asked the question of how do we get this incremental value, or this, essentially this positive externality, down at the individual level? Because ultimately, today, the voluntary offset market, and by the way, the compliance market, ultimately are professional markets, highly complex, highly regulated, highly liquid, highly specialized agreements between certain landowners or certain producers of something and some buyers of that particular offset. But that societal benefit doesn't really flow down to the means of production, or it comes to very few people. So I'm curious to know whether you think that your approach could actually be democratized, in your quotes, down to that individual person, so it becomes more tangible.
Good question. I've given it a lot of thought, and really what we're talking about is the trickle-down effect.
Right.
Sort of what we want to do is encourage projects all around the world to remove carbon from the atmosphere, decarbonise industry, etc., in a way that really gets people excited and gives them opportunities. We might call it bottom-up.
Yeah, exactly. So as you were saying that, that's exactly what I was thinking, that this approach has more it's more analogous to what has been the growth of crypto, for better or worse, than the top-down government approach that we currently see with command control, tax, or permits, and potentially has it took a long time for the financial services community to embrace the democratization of digital currency. It's been 10 years in the making and still relatively nascent. This strikes me as it has a similar set of attributes.
It does have decentralized attributes. To understand where the opportunity is to understand that, with an example, imagine in Africa, people working in rural areas, in community farms and so on, if they develop methodologies to store carbon in the soil, carbon farming of some kind, we could pay them with carbon currency down to the individual level on their smartphones. So all we need is to be certain scientifically that there are methods and accounting systems that can be applied with general rules. Then we can give reliable price signals to people across the developing world to earn money for carbon farming, carbon sequestration, and so on. However, the reason I think it can work much better under this model is that we have a single international institution under the UN with the universal standards, and then we can overlay that platforms to record and reward co-benefits. Whereas currently the carbon markets, voluntary and compliance, they're very, very fragmented. And I don't think they're coherent enough to scale completely to the level we would need this century.
I get that, and I think I agree with you personally. Obviously, the world has spent the better part of the last 30 years focused on either cap and trade, allowance programs, regulatory, non-regulatory, etc. So this is, and upsetting that apple cart is probably a losing proposition. This thing has to exist almost exogenous to this opportunity, exogenous to that. What keeps coming back in my mind when I think about, for those of us that read the newspaper, I saw the newspapers because I'm old, but whatever, news on your phone. Obviously, we've all watched the Guardian article. We've all seen the real, perceived, or whatever malfeasance in the voluntary markets, and we've seen the VAT fraud and manipulation of the regulated markets. And at the end of the day, we all know humans are humans, and they behave in self-centered, egotistical ways, which is why we have financial regulators and environmental regulators and securities regulators and tax regulators and auto regulators. There's a reason why those people exist in our society, and they are nascent in the carbon markets. And my guess is, given the fact that I've been in this space for the better part of 30 years, since I did my master's in it back in 91, I'm getting a sense that they're coming, the regulators. And that's probably a good thing in the grand scheme of things. So that's putting aside the dysfunction that's currently in carbon markets, right? Most humans don't know much about pricing or anything besides their home. They go to the supermarket every day. And I think the question really is how does the global carbon reward or the fiat currency approach toward carbon become a thing, right? That's the part that, in my own, as you and I have said over our couple of meetings, I'm excited about this, but I also know it has a long way to go because there's a sort of entropy away from you that people don't want it to happen. What do you need, or what skills or humans or institutions do you need to make this thing actually get some more legs? How can this audience of experts and guys who really care about this that wouldn't be here otherwise, how can they help you, make this thing a reality?
Well, I genuinely believe that we can get this off the ground. We just need to find the partners, organisations that want to collaborate with us to virtually demonstrate the policy. So what we'll do is a role-playing demonstration with stakeholders across industry, different businesses, different sectors, with economists, central bankers, and record everybody's opinion. We'll do simulations of the policy and document it and produce videos and so on. Once we have a nucleus of organisations and people to support that, I think the idea will simply move it along, because the world doesn't, I don't think the world economy has another option that can scale as readily and practically as this approach, because it has the top-down macroeconomics with the central bank backing of the carbon currency, and then it has the direct access to projects through the decentralized reward system and MRV.
So, given that backdrop, and given some of the folks in the audience here, how do you assure yourself that currency, in air quotes, that value certificate doesn't become either hyperinflationary, fraudulent, manipulated, just like other things in the world have done? Because there's good crypto and bad crypto, good air emissions and bad air emissions, high value currencies and not so high value currencies, and we don't want to become the Zimbabwe, whatever their currency is that comes in million ton notes. You ultimately want to create a currency that has stability, value, and people ascribe value to, right?
Yeah.
So how do as you've been wargaming this thing for 9 years, which is in carbon land, you're still in junior high school. You got a ways to go yet. Carbon's an ultra marathon by any stretch. Over the next X amount of years, how do we actually ensure ourselves that we're going down the right path and don't create something that ultimately is worse than the problem we currently have?
Well, obviously, it's going to take some serious evidence to convince regulatory institutions and central banks. So it won't happen overnight. It will happen in stages, with the demonstration, virtual demonstration. Then a few countries will pilot it, and then I'm predicting in 5 years, if we get the demonstration done, the risks of global warming will become so apparent that governments and politicians will be looking for this policy. Now, you asked the question, how do we make sure that this approach, the carbon reward, carbon currency, is considered to be trustworthy and economically worthwhile?
Exactly.
Well, there's two sides to that coin. There's the supply of the carbon currency, and that comes back to measurement, reporting, verification. What's the big advantage? We have a single international institution, and we're not selling the carbon to offsetters. So we de-risk it because we don't need offsetting. We stop offsetting. That's a huge improvement. And then we use long-term contracts, service level agreements or evergreen contracts that continually review and update the carbon ledger for every project, such that we have real record of carbon over the very long term, 100 years and rolling forward. So that's the quality issue for the carbon. Trust, that comes from the central bank. So the policy requires the agreement of the G20 at least to back the carbon currency with central bank purchases as required. So they won't actually have to buy the carbon currency all the time, only when the private sector isn't buying enough, and there's more to it.
Yeah, so, and I don't know, we've been, Delton and I have been talking for 49 minutes nonstop, so I think I'll open up questions in a second, but what occurs to me as you say that is there a way to do this on a more micro-regional basis? Do we have to start with, if we're going to wait for 20 central banks to agree to this, we'll all be dead. I'll be dead, you guys can still be alive, but I think the question ultimately is there a way to do this in a more regional or multi-regional way, or a more private way that really allows us to get scale as a proof of concept? And I know what in foreign currency exchange land, proof of concepts is in the billions, it's not in the millions. So I guess the question is, how do we get somebody how do we get a country to pilot this, or a regional or a set of regions, versus just allowing it to sort of wander loose in the firmament of central bankers, events and cocktail parties and the like. Now that I don't like cocktail parties, I'm just bored by the cocktail parties. That's separate.
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, but my vision or expectation is if we do a really good demonstration at a high level, make it visible to governments all around the world and the central banks. Keep in mind, central banks, they're all connected through networks like the green financial system and so on and so forth. They know what they're doing, all the projects going on.
They talk more than we think they talk.
Yeah, so it will be seen. Then I predict a few countries will step up thinking, let's pilot this, because if we build some of the platforms, we create the talent, we can attract the long-term economic benefits to our countries in terms of financial technology and other services.
I think that's the end of our prepared back and forth. If anybody's got questions or want to ask questions, we got another 20 minutes of Bhutanese kind time to talk about anything you guys like to talk about. We'll give you a mic since I think it's the Swedish are very loud next door.
Actually, the Chilean, of course, it's the Chileans.
Thank you so much.
It's always the Chileans.
Yeah. I'm just going to go back to some very basic ideas of the carbon rewards fiat currency. So, in the traditional world, a national currency is basically the military force that it has plus the GDP that it has. But how is this carbon reward?
I would say, actually, not to interrupt you, but currencies essentially were backed by gold.
Indeed.
Except for Bretton Woods. So that's pre-Bretton Woods, it was gold.
So for the is there any gold sword-like assets to be backed? For example, I know a lot of projects they're doing one coin to 1/10 of carbon offset as a very basic idea. So I think that answers my question. To go back to some of the basic design of the carbon rewards, and how does that relate to a traditional fiat currency's exchange rate?
I wish we had the TV working, because then I could show the slides. There's one particular slide that shows the floor price for the carbon currency that explains the mechanism in terms of why it becomes an attractive asset to buy. So the point we made is that national fiat currencies are backed by government, their police, the army, and GDP, more or less, and taxation. So fiat currencies have value, real world value. We don't need to create a reserve of gold or anything for this currency, because we're going to back it with those fiat currencies. The promise to buy the carbon currency by central banks to maintain this floor price, to defend the floor price. So if the floor price is rising, say from $20 a tonne in 2025, increasing up to say $250 a tonne in the year 2060, and then maybe gradually declining, that price signal being backed by central banks, by major central banks, is the forcing function that creates the attractiveness for this currency. And what it means is that private actors can buy the currency in the early stage and sell it later at a profit. So it has a certain yield, and it's calibrated. The price is calibrated to achieve a certain level of mitigation. So it's this guarantee. It's actually called a public finance guarantee by the world central banks to create this price signal over the long term, and that's where the value proposition comes from. Noting that with this guarantee, the private sector will be enticed to buy the currency as an investment or a low-risk asset, a safe haven asset. The more they're buying it, the better, because we're directly channeling the cost of mitigation into the private sector, which is what we need. The private sector represents more than 70% of the world economy. So if they don't pay for the mitigation, it's too much cost for government to deal with. So in this case, we share the cost with the private sector as investments, money drained out of other investments in preference, Then central banks expand the money supply whenever there's not enough private demand. And so that's where the cost is being channeled. Monetary inflation and a change in the mix of investments around the world, favouring the currency and mitigation.
Where different sects listening here. How do you deal with the complexity of the underlying unit, the 1 unit of carbon, because they have different costs, they have lots of different attributes, which is one of the issues around the voluntary market. So how do you think around that?
This is excuse me. Sorry about that. This is a very important technical question. One option is which is the adopted option, is we have special rules and formulas so that we can just price everything the way we need with one currency. If, on the other hand, you have very straightforward rules, you might need 100 different currencies for different technology types, but we're not doing that. So, to explain, we have an explicit global price for carbon removal, taking it from the atmosphere, and that creates a global market for direct air capture, carbon dioxide removal, and so on, whether it's on the land or ocean. Everything else, which is conventional mitigation, it's priced flexibly. So what we do is we create bespoke formulas or reverse auctions or other methods to make sure that we're offering enough carbon currency that it touches those price points that the private sector or state-owned enterprises are willing to decarbonise quickly. And so to do that, we use a notional mass, not an actual mass, when we develop these formulas. So conventional mitigation is highly flexible and it's strategically managed. What that means is we'd have a room full of experts and they'll sit down and try and figure out how are we going to decarbonise the entire energy sector and all industries. Where do we start? Make a list and then create ways to offer the reward to each of those sectors and industries using these bespoke formulas to encourage them to actually do it. Once they agree, that they sign on to service contracts that locks them in for the long term. And not just in time, they would have to eventually bring in all of their operations. So for Shell, for example, which is an international company, if they join the policy, they would have to eventually bring all of their operations in. And we'd set them on a schedule where we offer them enough carbon currency that they believe it's doable. So it's quite flexible. I can show you how it works. There's a paper I can give you if you really want to drill down. Yeah.
Other questions?
So I have a question, and this is related to the risk of reversals of mitigation and emission reductions. So from what I understand right now, there are some concerns in the carbon market that as it is right now, that projects could have the risk of having their mitigation or emission reductions reversed. Does that risk also exist under a carbon reward system? And if it does, how would you go about addressing that risk?
Thank you for the question. The risk still exists under carbon rewards. A good example will be forestry, because forests, they can desiccate with changes in climate, they can burn down, and you can't stop illegal loggers, for example. So the advantage here is that because we have these long-term contracts, we can force the project to pay back the carbon currency. And that's actually written into the contracts over the long term. So whenever a project starts up, they have to consider their own risk. And their investors will as well, because they're up for that money and they have to pay it back should they have some problem with their carbon inventory. Now, our contracts are a bit more sophisticated than that, because you need to give projects a bit of leeway and flexibility, because things can just happen unexpectedly, like extreme weather event, for example. So we'll let them go into arrears and give them enough time to make up. But if they can't, over say 5 years, 10 years, they'll go insolvent. And what we'll do is that will trigger a clause for
a capital call on part of that central bank in that country to then either expand or contract their supply? Question mark?
Insolvency. They'll declare bankruptcy.
Then that would withdraw, then that would decline. I'm just freewheeling here, I don't know what I'm talking about. And that would then essentially contract the carbon supply for that country.
Not for the country, this is still at the project level.
Okay.
At the project level. So let's say a forestry project went bankrupt because of fire. We pay them carbon currency, but they can't pay back because they're insolvent. We just charge a negative interest rate. We charge a negative interest rate on all the holdings of carbon currency to clear it out of the system. And that's all.
Gotcha. Other questions? We have, according to the schedule, 2 more minutes.
Thank you. Somewhat related question. You mentioned Ecuador.
I think I'll just stand up and shout out. Shall I answer that quiet?
Yeah, speak right up to the mic. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
No, you press the button.
Sorry about that. So you mentioned Ecuador. I'm curious to hear from you some lessons learned, because there was this whole agreement of setting up a fund to essentially keep oil in the ground. Fund wasn't fully replenished, and then Ecuador is in heavy debt. So they went back to oil drilling in a particular block in a national park. So just in relation to that, it's not a currency, but what are some of the lessons learned that could be applied here for safeguards, for making sure things like this don't happen? So in some ways linked to reversal.
Thanks for bringing up the Ecuador example. A Sunyi National Park, I think it's called. So the story that I heard was that they asked the world to pay them for the oil so they could keep it in the ground, not extract. They didn't receive the money they needed, so they decided to extract, and then recently they had a democratic vote to decide how much they would extract. With this policy, if it's implemented, it wouldn't have that unreliability. The actual reward, because it's backed by central banks with this guarantee, will always be reliable. So we would negotiate with the Ecuadorian government or the leaseholders. We might do a reverse auction globally, or we might prioritise the Amazon and the Congo Basin because these are highly valuable ecosystems worth more than just the oil. So once we negotiate the price that's right, that carbon currency is issued with a contract. They have to leave it in the ground, and they also have to use much of that carbon currency to build renewable energy assets somewhere. It doesn't have to be in the exact same location. It could be in the same region or continent or country. So it's fairly well locked down, and the oil and gas won't be extracted for at least 100 years. You can't force people to do something 200 or 300 years in the future, so it'll be maybe a 100-year contract rolling forward to keep it in the ground.
Max, is that Max?
Right. Thank you very much. Awesome to see you guys here. So at this COP, right, COP28 in UAE, like what kind of things would make the policy work happen, or what kind of things? How can the COP accelerate development of technology?
I was paying so much attention to the feedback sound, I completely lost the question, Max.
At this COP28, like, what are the ingredients at COP28 that can accelerate the development or adoption of the policy?
What happening here can help us accelerate this?
Exactly.
I would say
How can we get people in the audience to help support the policy?
Yes, how do we get beyond?
we need somebody highly charismatic to come up here and convince everybody. Maybe I'm not that person, but unless we find someone highly charismatic, we're just going to have to network until we find people in institutions and organizations who will help us publish the policy. That's the first step. If we can publish this policy with a few organizations around the world next year, it will be out there and a lot of people will talk about it, and I'm sure we'll find the money to then demonstrate. So that's the first step.
It's pretty clear that command control doesn't work. It's pretty clear that society doesn't have the appetite for tax, although be it episodically, you've seen Canada implement tax, takeaway tax. Some of the Australians do. I'm also familiar with taxes coming and going. And as much as I like comments, and I truly love them, they are having a hard time. And so the question ultimately is how do you continue
using economic incentives to convince people that they have to behave differently. And I think that's the challenge for what we all face. And single coin project stuff will be too illiquid and too bespoke to really attract a lot of capital. I don't have any problem with coins, it's so much. This may be too macro, that might be too micro. There might be a happy blend between these two things. I'm not sure what that answer is yet because I'm not that smart. But I know too micro is too illiquid and too bespoke, and too macro has the benefit of, as we saw with the EU ETS, became a laundry for the Italian and Armenian mafia. I think the question comes down to, we should just be all honest with each other. One of the biggest issues that I had, this is my 15th COP, is I'm saying the same stuff for 15 years. It's getting old. We have to acknowledge what's failed. We have to acknowledge what succeeds, and we have to be adults about it. And anybody who can't explain to me in 5 minutes or less shouldn't be allowed to speak about anything. Because the reality is, we're not curing cancer, right? This is simple behavioral norms and changing industrial process, and how do we pay for the historically incurred equipment capital? So there's been trillions of dollars invested. So it shouldn't surprise us that it's very expensive and hard to move from one technology to another. That's because there's trillions of dollars of stuff invested. Like if you use your cell phone in New York magically enough, it's better on a desert island than your phone system. Why? You have the old phone system. It's really not that complicated. The same is true with all of this industrial turnaround. It won't be slow. And so as much as people want to slack off what Dr. Sultana said, he is correct. There's trillions and trillions of dollars invested. It will take a long time to move down that paradigm shift, right? And this is no different. But if we can democratize it and make it a common fiat currency or an incentive, we'll create a tool to manage carbon risk through, put it on ICE or on Bloomberg or putting a financial tool to manage risk. Then it will have a life of its own, right? We've seen Bitcoin do lots of things for lots of people, but it wasn't the guys who first started Bitcoin. They didn't know it was going to be, for years, guys lived in New York. You can go buy dumplings in the East Village through a Bitcoin ATM. It's a very weird thing. You go to an automatic dumpling place and you can use Bitcoin and buy food. There are very few places you can do that, but you can at Brooklyn Dumplings on 2nd Avenue and 8th Street on Astor Place, on St. Mark's Place, should be one of my dumplings. The point I'm making is that I'm sure that the guys who played Bitcoin had no idea that you could get an ATM with dumplings in it. True. I've never used it, but I have physically seen it. So the point is, who knows where this fiat currency thing will go if it's valid, viable, enforceable, transparent, and accounted correctly. The issue is how do we get society to adopt it? Right? More questions?
Probably it's better if speak without the mic. I'm someone from Turkey. I just want your views in terms of the carbon market. As of now, the major markets are like the EU and let's say some of the developed countries where there's no price discovery system. It's policy driven, highly subsidized. So even though we talk about the carbon market,
they're using UN carbon and markets and oxymoron is what they're saying.
So what are your views in terms of under Article 6, the new regime that is going to be coming about? That's the first question. Second question.
Well, should we take it in pieces? But let's do that one. Let's take it. So we've been talking about Article 6 for 10 years, a long time. And maybe we'll get it done now. I don't know. I'm not a negotiator. So if you're saying, do we need to have more compliance markets? Yes, we do. Do we need transparency? Yes, we do. Do we need simplicity? Yes, we do. Are the guys that are doing that over here focus on simplicity and transparency? Not so much. So I think the question you have to ask yourself is, whatever comes out of this, will this be functional? Right? The voluntary carbon markets are clearly having a very hard time right now. They're having a hard time because they're not transparent, they're bilateral, bespoke, and complex. And that's why they're having a hard time. The regulated markets, Reggie, CAR, whatever, they're okay. They're rolling along and moving. The ETFs are doing very well. Why? It's a level of generality up a notch, and you don't have to be an expert in the perturbation of forest land in place X or place Y. So your point is totally well taken. So what I find most interesting is that Dev and I were sitting over here a couple of nights ago having a bottle of scotch together, with my Vietnamese friends, is that we're going from centralized carbon markets to there are dozens and dozens of countries that want to make carbon markets now. It's funny, it's taken them 40 years to figure this out. I don't know why it's a thing. It's a thing now. So we're going to have lots and lots of carbon markets, which means we're going to have lots and lots of fraud, lots and lots of KYC, know your customer issues, lots and lots of regulation, and lots of regulators. I guess that's good, but it's going to be very slow, very complicated, better than what we got, but it's going to get worse before it gets better, by definition, because you have all these new entrants who want to regulate. Regulators don't want to deregulate. Regulators they can't help themselves. That's what they do, they regulate, which is great. My mom is a regulator. My family regulators. I have no issue with regulation. The issue is how encumbered it does to the business model. So the beauty of what Delton's talking about is it sits on top of that entire system and allows you. So, for instance, if you were buying and selling carbon offsets in the new regional Bhutanese market, or whatever market, I don't want to make Nigeria's market, right? It's easy to make offsets. It's extraordinarily hard to get short offsets. You can't sell real commodities you don't own. It's really tough. So you can't manage price risk. And so you have these big mismatches. Huge volatility in their earnings stream. Really tough. So not that effective a tool if you can't have both a long and a short. What I like about what Delton's talking about is it might provide a institutional level, scalable ability to manage risk. So what we're talking about here is the price risk of the transition. So you want to run a matchbook of carbon assets and carbon liabilities. Right now you get the whole market swings from long to short. You can make carbon offsets out the wazoo for years at a time at low price. And then you want to go sell them, and you got to sell them in 1, 2, and 3, and 5 year strips. Except to .com guys and 5 guys made money. It's not a two-way market. If anybody tells you that, they're not telling you the truth. And so the reality is, how do you make market function? Why do people want to buy these things? What are they going to do with them? And that's the real challenge with these offsets. Versus where, in this case, it's a natural accretion of value. It describes natural value, and people are inherently creative with natural value. I don't mean natural value like nature value. I mean like fiat currencies. I have some of my value right here. I've got some currency. Looks like a triangle. So the issue is, what do you do with this stuff, right? If you have a lot of, and as you, some of you who may we use the word, as you use the word carbon market, etc. So let's just be very clear. Carbon offsets, carbon allowances are neither securities. They don't go on the balance sheet. You can't factor them. You can't monetize them. And they're limited regulatory rights governed by regulation. They're extraordinarily liquid. They're more liquid than your house. They're more liquid than anything you ever touched in your life. So they really aren't financial assets in the way you would think of a financial asset. Why? Because you grant them at the nation-state level or at the voluntary level. And until they become financial assets, which, by the way, I think that's a very hard push for 100 different reasons for a glass of wine some other time, you're going to have the kind of illiquidity and confusion around what it is. So we use words like carbon and market. It's really trade by appointment, regulatory right, bilaterally negotiated by a bunch of people about some behavioral norm. That's why nature-based carbon is having such a hard time, because it's very hard to value a Yeti in the case of Bhutan, or a yak or whatever, and then against something else, and then some carbon. It just really hard. It hurts to think about it, but that's what Red Plus is trying to do. I have no issue with people putting money in Red Plus. God bless them. But if it's an investment, they're making a mistake. Sorry.
It's okay.
You had a second question. I didn't mean to.
Basically, I'm talking about the European carbon border adjustment tax.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
I think that's going to affect especially the poorer countries.
That's a great question. So carbon loading exports and imports. Yeah.
Well, with the global carbon reward, it's from the perspective of a country, from the perspective of a government, it's foreign income. It's revenue coming from offshore. For example, tourism draws money from overseas. When you export any commodity, you're bringing in money. It's the same concept. So the government probably would be very happy for people to mitigate and earn as much carbon rewards as possible from an economic perspective. There doesn't have to be a border adjustment of any kind for earning rewards. However, the government will probably think, how can we generate more tax revenue? And they'll encourage their economies to decarbonise, and if they don't, they'll probably raise carbon taxes. Why? They can generate revenue from carbon taxes, and they've got a good excuse. They can earn rewards to pay for the mitigation at the same time. So it's a carrot and stick approach. It supports the fiscal budget of governments and of businesses because it's essentially a stimulus package targeted purely at mitigation to make it profitable. And I think it's worth just summarising with one comment, and that is, today in the narrative around climate here at COP and so on, people who speak on behalf of government, they typically say, look, we've got a role to play, but we can't afford to solve this problem. The private sector has to help out. And then the private sector says, look, we're trying, but we have fiduciary duty to make a profit. We can't afford to mitigate extremely to follow the 1.5 target, so don't look at us. Where's the subsidy? And then the central bank says, well, don't look at us. It's the government's problem, and we don't have a mandate to step in. So the whole thing isn't working. My argument is the problem stems back to the conceptual model of the market failure. I argue there is another kind of externalised cost, a network effect, a systemic problem all through the economy, needs to be corrected by central banks with this reward. But that's a position I take, but if you're interested, I have some papers that explain this. It hasn't been vetted by the world's economists, but that's why we want to publish.
I have a question. So, Delton, I remember you mentioning at one point, in response to somebody's question or a comment, you said, well, is that a economic or finance question, or is that a climate question? So sometimes when you talk about these markets, often the focus is on profit making or revenue earning and all that, but we forget the actual reason why we are going into this, to really deal with with the climate crisis and to get to the source of all of these problems. Tony, yourself too, I mean, you have been in this business, you've been in this market. You have a long experience of having actually dealt with this, on first hand. So, what are your thoughts as to where the carbon market is now? Because there's so much hype around that. There are a lot of new entrants, a lot of people who think this is a good way to make a quick buck, but not necessarily tied with the climate equation. So, I would just like to hear maybe from the two of you your individual thoughts on where we are at this point.
Those are, it'd be interesting.
Let's see, how many of the people in this room are under the age of 40? Whoa, there you go. Okay, so you guys are here because you believe in some kind of pricing thing, incentive for people to change their behavior. If you go out and talk to the humans that you know in your family and stuff, and you explain to them that you want to be paid, not to emit or incentivize to change your behavior, and you talk, and my guess is you guys are in the minority of your age group. What concerns me most is that we keep reinventing the wheel. We've been making prices on externalities as a species. I hate to break it to you, since 1847, in the Victorian age. And we've been doing that. We do it in buildings, we do it in water, we do it in set-asides and riparian rights and all this kind of stuff. And this is the fourth boom-bust cycle in carbon I've been involved in. And it's like Groundhog Day. And it hurts, personally. And if you meet the OG gangsters of carbon, I can get them all together from the set, Project 77, I hate to break it to you, was written in 1977. And when I did my master's on it in 1991, I thought I had found God. And then my advisor at Yale was like, dude, you're like the 1,000th resource economics thesis on this subject I've seen in my career, so join the party. Which made me very depressed after I just spent $120,000 to get the degree. But nonetheless, I think the challenge at the end of the day is adoption and willingness for people to do these things. And what happens, to your point, is people forget, right? They have their lives, they're concerned about eating, housing, food, whatever. And what I like about what Delton is saying, and I told him this today, is this is a democratization event, right? The only thing you see in price in your life, right, is your house. You don't put a price on your dog or your cat or your parakeet, but you have to put a price on your house, your job, and your net worth. And everything else in carbon is at this sort of G2G corporate level, and there was an idea what the hell's going on. No matter what they tell you. So you have governments double counting, triple counting, additionality, all this stuff, right? The number of presidential level conversations I've had around the world, I've had 10 this year, some of the major people here have been doing this for a really long time. And they'll say, I want to monetize my carbon benefit for my social service. Ex-Latin country fired me up and said, hey, we're going to sell all this carbon forward to some Swiss trading company. This is a true story. Can't get into specifics. And we're going to fund out a pension fund for the next year and a half. And I said to the president, interesting idea, sir, is it in addition, is it in the budget or not? Do you have an idea if you have these carbon offsets? And of course, the reality was they already given them back in bond. They had no idea what the balance was because there was no information flow. He wasn't trying to be mean or manipulative or evil. He just had no clue, and he's in no country that needs to raise revenue, right? If you adopt what Delton was talking about, that's not an issue. That goes away, right? This thing can sit on top of all that. If they want to create an offset system and monetize it for the social benefit of the society, God bless them. They can do that. The big issue here is the ability for people to deal with pricing. People don't like prices. No, they don't want to be told their house is higher or lower in value. That's why because they lead off. So you also get brokers charge 7% commissions. Or they did too until they broke that recently in New York. So monopoly thing. But so the real challenge, to your point, is getting people to think about it in a asset liability capital management way and manage risk. Until they do that, I had a guy who has a red project that's upside down in Southeast Asia, buy me lunch or breakfast session. And he was slacking off an African project because he thought his project was better, but his project's upside down. And I said to him that if he thought it was worth 10 units, so he's out telling you it's worth 10 bananas, and lo and behold, the next bid for it was 5 bananas. And then I was in another meeting, and somebody said that project, 5 bananas, 1 banana. And I said to the guy, I said, like, dude, you have $50 million in this thing, you like it. Do you really care, to your point? Do you need that? Do you need to mark that thing to market, or are you just happy with it because it's doing what it's supposed to be doing? They said, I'm kind of happy with it doing what it's doing, but I'm afraid it's going to decline in value. But until you have that price signal, we had no idea what the value was. You don't change your behavior, right? So that's the thing that is difficult about offset markets, unless we have unless it's on our TV right next to the clock every day. Local offsets are worth 6 bananas. We're not going to really know what to do, right? And so you see offset prices going all over the place, ultimately because, as I said earlier in my remarks, there's not a natural demand function. So it kind of goes, it has these peaks and valleys. So it's very hard. It's not to use it for anything, right? You wouldn't invest in it. Like you want it because you're 35 or whatever you are. You want it. You're excited about it. But would you put your money in? Probably not, right? You probably wouldn't put money in it. So the challenge for all of us is, if we're going to make these things, we should use them. Otherwise, they're just going to keep on going. And that's why I like the idea of central banks either contracting or expanding the supply of these things to create incentive. They're really good at that in most hard currency Western countries, and in China, obviously, being in Singapore, but not so good in Cambodia, not so good in Zimbabwe, pretty good at it in OECD Europe, etc. Anyway, other questions? People got to go. We already are 12 minutes over our time. Look, we're not going to go anywhere. We haven't talked to anybody about it.
Firstly, I'd like to start off by expressing our deep apologies to everyone present here, especially to the esteemed speakers for delaying the session. We clearly did not see it coming, and that technical error was unforeseeable, unavoidable, and an unfortunate act of God. But we're truly grateful to you for your patience, so thank you so much. We've had really compelling dialogues this evening, but we can't think of a more meaningful conversation than this one to end the day. So this is the last session for the day. Before we close the session, I'd like to call up on stage Mr. Tawan to present to our esteemed speakers our small token of appreciation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you very much.
And do join us tomorrow as we continue to tell Bhutan's, infamous conservational stories. Thank you.
بشر لا حضر